Good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Sands, and I'm director of the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And I'm doubly blessed because I'm also a member of the Executive Council of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, an institution that I've been involved with over the years pretty regularly, thanks to the great Jim Blanchard, my former boss, always my boss in some ways, who brought me into the organization. It is an absolutely unique institution in the Canada-U.S. relationship, a joint institute for the study of legal issues in the Canada-U.S. relationship, co-sponsored by Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and Western Ontario University, or just Western as they sometimes go by, in beautiful London, Ontario. It had its origins in a man named Henry King, who was a Nuremberg prosecutor, who found himself at Case Western doing law, and also Sidney Picker. Now, both of them have passed, but Sidney Picker was an outstanding scholar of international law and is still very well regarded in the legal community. So that's the august beginnings. I now want to introduce you to the U.S. Managing Director of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, Steve Petras, will get us started this morning. But welcome.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everybody to our annual experts meeting in Washington, D.C. this year on critical minerals. And I want to just give a brief introduction to certain people that we should say thank you to. Of course, number one is Christopher Sands and allowing us to tag team this event with the Canada Institute of the Wilson Center, which Chris is the executive director. And also, special thanks today goes out to James Graham, Chief Legal Officer of Cleveland Cliffs. Cleveland Cliffs is the sponsor of our luncheon today, so everybody gets a lunch today, and we can thank James for that. Much appreciated. He's on our executive committee. And as Chris mentioned, we have two co-chairs of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. We have Jim Blanchard, former congressman, former governor of Michigan, and former U.S. ambassador to Canada. And we have Jim Peterson, former Minister of International Trade for Canada. And additionally, we have two presidents, the Dean of the Law Faculty at Western Ontario, Erica Chamberlain, and the Co-Dean of Case Western Reserve Law School, Michael Scharf. So on behalf of all of those and our whole executive committee, welcome. So today, we're going to talk about critical minerals, and this is something that the executive committee was very concerned about. So I'm going to just set the stage very quickly. It was actually an issue that the government was concerned about for many, many years. And in 2017, President Trump said, well, we better look seriously at this, and he issued an executive order, and he wanted some analysis done. And it's interesting because the assignment was given to the Department of Interior, and then the U.S. Geological Survey actually was asked to come up with the list of critical minerals. And they were wondering, well, what do we include? So they included minerals that are very important for the production of products in the United States, have strategic value, and are subject to stress or challenge in their supply chains. Just this February, the U.S. Geological Survey published a report and listed 50 critical minerals on that list. Many of them, of course, you know about, things like lithium and cobalt, etc. But then there are a lot of others that are, nobody understands except chemists, and they're known as rare earth metals or platinum metals. It's interesting, of those 50, the Department of Energy was asked to comment upon the sustainable supply of 35 of those mineral commodities. And of those 35, they found out that 14, there was no U.S. domestic production of those at all. And 31 of those 50, the U.S. is more than 50% reliant on imports. And in fact, of those 31, 15 are 100% reliant on imports. So the question is, well, why is this a big deal? Well, according to the International Energy Agency, if we are to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, we're going to need 6 times the amount of critical minerals that are being produced today by 2040. And also, according to them, it takes a lot of lead time to come up with that. And so you look at things like electrification, wind turbines, and all of that, and you see that the amount of critical minerals that go into these new vehicles, for example, are huge compared to combustion engines, where you almost hardly needed any critical minerals. And just to give you an example, a single wind turbine typically requires about a ton of rare earth minerals, in addition to 3 metric tons of copper. So today we're going to figure out, well, what do we do? What does Canada and the United States do about critical minerals? And our first panel, we're going to have 2 panels. We're going to have an industry panel, and then we're going to have a government policy panel. Then we're going to take a break. Each panel is going to run about an hour. Then we'll take a short break and move over to the cafeteria, where we're going to have a luncheon presentation by Matthew Lanowski, who is with the Department of Defense, responsible for the supply of critical minerals. So to kick us off, we will start out with our industry panel. And our moderator is our own executive committee member, Diane Francis. Diane is a noted reporter, investigative reporter, and journalist and columnist. She's actually an American, but she lives in Canada. So she claims, loyalty to both countries. And she's been publishing very interesting articles and blogs about what's going on in the Ukraine, what's going on in the election. Just today she wrote a column that's called Mid-Termination. So anyway, without further ado, to introduce her panel, Diane.
Thank you. I have 2 passports, by the way. I'm proud of that. You set it up beautifully, so you kind of know that we have these critical minerals that are absolutely essential to moving forward in terms of creating renewable energy products and so on, and to reduce emissions. I'm going to give you an overview, and then I'm going to go to our panel, who are in the trenches, so to speak. They're in the private sector dealing with all these things. But first of all, the big overview and the trends, the overview of what's going on. I've covered for 50 years journalism, business, mining, energy, and finance and politics in Canada and around the world. Canada is a major commodity nation. We have just about everything there is to have, but we don't produce a lot of it for a lot of different reasons. And so we've always taken a big interest in Canada in mining and commodities, and I've been on the board of directors of 2 publicly listed gold companies and on private sector unlisted mining companies looking for some of these rare earth commodities. So the big picture that overhangs all of this, I'm going to start with that. First of all, Russia is the biggest commodity-rich country in the world. And by their own doing, they're now offline in terms of the commodity supply situation. This is because either they can't do it, or because of sanctions, or because of permanent bans as a result of the murder and mayhem that they've been undertaking. They don't have the capability of doing it. They were very reliant on foreign investment and in foreign talent, and for just about everything that they do, whether it's Arctic LNG or whether it's their mines in Siberia, and so on. So that's a very important thing, and that, of course, has driven the inflation of all commodity prices, because they're also a big food manufacturer and farm manufacturer. So when you take, maybe one of the major commodity producing economies off grid, then everybody else has got to scramble and make up, and that's made the prices rise and will keep them high, because I think Russia's going to go through some cataclysmic change once Ukraine wins. So that's Russia. The other big commodity producing nations are Canada, Australia, the United States, and Brazil. And so they will be, and this is food as well as metals, minerals, and fossil fuels in the case of Canada and the United States. China is also another big overhanging factor in all of this. China has strategically targeted rare earths and other precious commodities that are essential for producing technologies and manufactured products that they have specialized in. Very smart. They didn't have a lot of this stuff in their own country, so they went out and got some. They did it through mining deals. They did it through swapping. I'll build you a railroad if you give me a cobalt deposit, that kind of thing, through the Belt and Road Initiative. Very, very smart, very strategic, and they have an enormous appetite for this stuff. Do they have a lock on a lot of it? Can they control the supply of a lot of it? I don't think they quite have the kind of lock on some of these materials that, say, for instance, OPEC has over oil. But they are very important and very prominent and very difficult to deal with. On the other hand, China now, this is the other overhanging situation, is going through, I think, a very difficult period ahead. They call it peak China. I think China's peaked economically and geopolitically because of Xi's friendship with Putin. And, you know, that's like I said in one column, imagine taking a selfie with your best friend and declaring you're going to love him for life, and 3 days later he invades the country. So this is his problem. It's certainly been a bad mark on his judgment and a problem for China. And of course, China has been meticulously careful not to help the war effort at all, which has again alienated him from his pal. And so it's not orphaned, but it's got some challenges. The other challenges it has is it has staggering debt. Staggering debt. Probably the highest indebtedness per capita or per GDP of any country in the world now. That's because of the COVID lockdowns, which have really impacted negatively their economy and their reputation as a supply chain supplier. Some of that business never came back even after the lockdown stopped. They have a real estate bubble that is horrifying, much bigger than the 2008 mortgage problem that the United States had that nearly brought down the global economy. But China is still very rich and has been a saver. So they're able to manage a lot of this, but the real estate bubble is so large that it really threatens the net worth of virtually their entire middle class, which they've worked 40 years to create, faster than any country in the world has done, to their credit. It's an amazing country in many respects. So that's the issue. The United States, I think, is chugging along. That's noisy. It's unruly, but it's the most incredible economy the world's ever known, and I think it's going to stay that way. That's a personal opinion. Dynamic and amazing and able to evaluate quickly and move on a dime, and has great capital markets and a reserve currency. The other factors, though, that overhang everything is what happened to supply chains as a result of COVID. That broke the supply chain, and actually broke it's led to the deglobalization in terms of trade and in many ways, because people couldn't rely. Then they suddenly started to realize if they can't get masks for their hospitals, what about critical minerals to build our cars? And that's all done in China. We better change stuff, and let's do it now and quickly. So that's created a huge dislocation all across. Then the war in Russia changed the supply chains again. There were things that were coming out of Russia that, oh, we got to get it somewhere else, or we hate them, they're terrible people, we can't buy their stuff. Oh, there's sanctions, we'll get in trouble if we do. All of that is another readjustment. And then the drumbeat behind everything is the incredible technological advances that are underway, mostly coming out of the United States. And these are in the renewable energy field, whether it's electric cars, battery technology, biotech, pharma tech. It's quite dazzling how quickly the world is changing, and that means a complete restructuring of inventory. I mean, you got to get the good robot instead of the old robot. You got to get the new pharma instead of the old pharma. So that's another dislocating but vibrant situation going on. And all of this impacts commodities, all the way down to what we're going to talk about today, the critical ones, in particular because they are in greater demand than before. So that's the overlying picture. The issues, and I'm going to turn first, we have two guys here. Eric Lee is on the consulting side. He's a geologist. Originally, he's been in the car, automobile manufacturing, electrification worlds. He's based out of Michigan, and he's going to address, in light of all these overhangs, what he sees happening in the private sector world. And also, if you don't mind, Eric, commenting on what governments are not doing to help, because the other issues is security, geopolitical cost, and environmental concerns. So over to you, Eric. He's CEO of Copper Country Capital.
Thank you, Diana. So one of the things I'd just like to say is that for those of us that have been in the mobility field, this is the most exciting time since the invention of the internal combustion engine. It just is. You're watching a seismic shift in not only how people move, but what they move in, and also how they're going to get there. And we're doing this all under the backdrop of removing carbon from the equation. So my career arc is somewhat eclectic. I'm a geological engineer by degree, so my buddy Chris here is doing the work that I thought I was going to start off doing, but commodity prices collapsed. Right now they're on a high, and I ended up doing a quick pivot into sustainability and environmental engineering, which got me into alternative fuels, which got me into hydrogen fuel cells, which got me into electrification. At the end of it, I was working for a major OEM, who I'm not representing today, but a major OEM doing a global electrification strategy. So I literally had a soup to nuts view of, getting stuff out of the ground, the utilities that serve electrification, and the vehicles that they go into. And that gives me some different perspectives on this. It's more of a ability to zoom up, but then also focus on the details that matter. And I heard a great phrase yesterday in this very room, but it was the tyranny of details and how they can make life difficult. And that's some of the challenges that I think Diane articulated incredibly well on what's changed. And I'll say the last 10 years, but especially in the last couple of years, I think the pandemic really highlighted the fragility of the global commodity and supply chain network. And every single private entity on the planet has a purchasing department whose sole mission is to drive cost out of the system, which means that you're aggregating things into one spot to get economies of scale. You're going to the lowest cost country for supply solutions. But what we learned is, and we've learned this lesson a couple of times and it repeats itself, is that, it can take a 27-cent part to shut down a plant that's the size of most cities, okay? And so there's a danger when you spread things out that much. So I think some governments have gotten the message. They put it in local content. That's one play on that is providing capital and resources and employment at home, but it also helps de-risk the system. One of the conversations that I had with some of the other panelists before getting up here is we were talking about, right now we're going through an inflation spike, but if we keep the lessons learned of this and we don't aggregate all our sourcing into just low-cost solutions, what does that do to the costs overall? So instead of having 2 or 3 suppliers do something, you got a couple of dozen spread out geographically. Does pricing ever come down to where it was? And I think the short answer is no. But these are challenges. But let's talk about the opportunities. Bloomberg has cited that over the next, up to 2050, from today to 2050, that e-mobility, electrification, and I'm talking not just of vehicles, but of the infrastructure required to support it and all the technology that would enable it, that you're looking at a $53 trillion opportunity. Trillion, that's a T, 53. And that explains, by the way, why you see thousands of startups in many countries trying to capitalize on the opportunity. Because challenges, adversity just create an opportunity, and I think that is one of the more exciting things. Because you got to remember, if you, I was talking to my former governor, Jim Blanchard, over there. We grew up in what I'll call the Rust Belt era days, and you look at the way things used to be. You can't be that way anymore. We have some, I'll call it West Coast contingents, the new automotive OEMs, and then you have a ton of startups that are all working towards a 100% electrified solution. So one of the things I would just ask you to think about is that, when somebody says to, I'll say, a legacy OEM, what's a legacy OEM? Somebody that's been in business, for close to 100 years, that has an internal combustion heritage. Why don't they go all electric yesterday? Well, the thing is, it's called stranded capital. It's called that electrification doesn't solve every use case. It's getting better, and technology will enable it to solve more. But right now it's forecasted that by somewhere between 2040 and 2050, the global passenger vehicle fleet will then be overtaken by battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So, internal combustion is going to be around, but you're looking at a multi-trillion-dollar shift into electrification. So that's going to create some angst, and it's going to create a lot of opportunity. And there's also going to be a gap between wealthy nations and emerging economies. Some of that will be due to cost structure. Some of that will be due to they have different solutions to get to a low carbon, no carbon. Brazil, for instance, with alcohol fuels. They're going to focus on that. It doesn't mean that they won't have electrification, but they're going to use a different set of tools to get there. Other things to think about is that electrification is not a peanut butter approach to transportation needs. Certain transportation, for instance, heavy duty, has a hard time with batteries. Why is that? It sounds like if you're pulling something heavy with an electric motor, which is what trains do, they use diesel to power an electric motor, you have 100% torque at 0 RPM. It's the perfect solution, except when you have to put a battery on it, it starts cannibalizing some of the functionality of the vehicle, towing capacity, payload, things like that. So there's going to be a need for different solutions for propulsion technologies, just like today. It'll be different parts of the pie, but instead of being diesel and gasoline, it might be diesel and hydrogen fuel cells, okay, for heavy-duty applications. And then, the companies that take us there, if they're new, they're going straight to dedicated architectures. What does the phrase dedicated architectures mean? It means that it's built with the premise that it's 100% electric all the time. If you're a legacy OEM, you're probably going to have a dual path approach where you'll have a dedicated architecture, strategically outlined but tactically executed on a cross-platform volume player. But there's some things that you're going to still need to have some kind of internal combustion component to it. So they might have more of a hybrid or PHEV solution. In your head, if you're going, well, that's a lot of fancy talk, what exactly does that mean? let's put it in kind of a Midwesterner, I'm driving up north to go snowmobiling scenario, okay? You can have a Tesla pickup truck, you can have the Ford Lightning, you can have all these. But until infrastructure catches up with the vehicle and the charging times come down, there's going to be certain end applications where it might be handy to have both electric and also an internal combustion component so that you can pull your car through with a trailer, fill up quickly, and keep going up north. More of a charge when you want to, not when you need to scenario. So that's, all these things, by the way, from a critical materials, still have big batteries. So they're going to need lithium. They're going to need copper. They're going to need cobalt and nickel and all the other strategic metals. You know, the mega trend that's sitting on top of all this as we look at transportation is that, you know, when I hopped on the planet, it was roughly 3.1 billion people on the planet, okay? Today, I think we're right around 8 billion. Now, most of the projections show that it's starting to go somewhat asymptotic and that by 2062, it would be somewhere over 10 billion, between 10 and 11 billion. So, you know, it's sheer folly to think that everything that we've done historically, when you have more people and on average using more resources per person, can stay the same. And you know, there's an old saying that everything that you use has either been mined or grown. So the chairs, the clothes you wear, you know, the plane you hopped on to get here, you know, the aluminum came out of the ground, you know, the land was, you know, exploited for that. So there's nothing that we can do that doesn't have a footprint, but we need to be judicious and we need to be thoughtful as we move forward, because as more people hop onto this planet, we're going to have to, if we want to maintain this kind of lifestyle, be more efficient. And that's one of the things that electrification can do for us, because it's a lot easier to move electrons around in general for most applications than it is to use fossil fuels if you get the storage solution down. The other part of this is that, you know, on the government side, one of the charts I used to explain when people go, is it real this time, is a chart of all the megafactories that are being built up, you know, or gigafactories, I'm sorry, for building batteries. There's, as of last year, between the plants that are already built and the ones that are in construction or plan to start being built within 18 months, there was over 300 gigafactories in production. I mean, that's amazing. 10 years ago, there was zero, or close to zero, maybe one. You know, it's real this time, so it's going to happen. And when you look at going to a low carbon, no carbon scenario, it takes a real fundamental shift on how we look at our resources. Diana and Chris and I were talking just before this kicked off, and you know, one of the points is, and she highlighted in the resources in Russia and, you know, South America and Australia and all that. All these resources were put there before humans were on the planet, okay? We came on the planet and we scribbled little lines saying, this is mine, this is yours. You can't control where mineralization happens. And I don't think we understand where all the mineralization is yet. I mean, we frankly, just in exploration times, just started looking for some of these in earnest now, because we realize, and the phrase critical is absolutely correct, how critical they are. So that's something that I think that I'm encouraged to hear, that there's been more activity to have a more thoughtful approach to developing relationships that can get us to a low carbon / no carbon solution. And, you know, there's some old metals that we use today, copper being one of them, that are going to have to do double duty. They're going to be in the vehicle. A nice vehicle, you know, can have between 30 and 50 pounds of copper in it. A PHEV or a BEV could have 3 to 4 times that amount, all right? And the infrastructure that is required to support these vehicles is going to require copper. And when you think about how copper is used, it goes in and it's very recyclable. That's the good news. But a lot of these applications it's going into, for instance, on the infrastructure side of the house, it's going to be there for 30 to 50 years. So it's not going to be back in the system soon. So there's maybe not a copper crisis per se, but the timeline to develop a copper mine can be between 1 and 2 decades. So if you plan on hitting your 2025 or 2030 or 2035 goals, you better start having your team putting together the preliminary economic analysis and start doing, what it takes to develop a mine. And one of the things, Diane, you asked to comment on just the some of the challenges that we see with governments. These mines run for long periods of times. They're in areas with emerging economies with maybe not the most stable governments. And so you're asking companies to go in and make multi-billion-dollar investments / bets that what they do isn't going to be nationalized or is going to be a resource that they can do. I think that's kind of what slows some of that, but we're going to need to figure out how to speed that up. And then, lastly, I'd just like to point out that, Steve, you brought up the point on the list of critical materials, and, I applaud them for kind of, making a list of prioritization. But, one of the concerns I think we all have is that, if we make something and we also we get it here and we get it somewhere else, there's negotiation. If we can't get it here, it's tough to negotiate. So we got to look at that. So I started hearing the music playing, so I'll be quiet now.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of things which we won't get into it now, but maybe later, but maybe some of the audience can pick up on this. I see the big impediments to electrification. NIMBY, not in my backyard. It's now become banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. And we see this as a commodity nation in Canada. So pipelines are hard enough to get approved. Transmission lines are even harder. And building out a grid to accommodate even a doubling of the electric cars in the country is going to be a daunting, probably impossible task, unless it's part of a national security emergency effort, kind of almost a wartime thing. So that's something to also consider. Now we're going to turn to Chris Doornbos. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
It's R. Doornbos. Okay, he's CEO of E3 Lithium. It's kind of a funny beast to Americans. We were talking before, I'm trying to explain to Eric that most of our resource industries are built on the basis of federally owned subsurface mineral rights with permissions and licenses, or done in partnership with governments, and private sector comes in to provide technology, capital markets, that sort of thing. So he's going to hopefully explain, it's kind of hard for, I think, the Americans to understand what your setup is. So he's a hybrid almost of these kinds of things. And it's an interesting project, and it's in Alberta, like so much other magnificent resource endowment. So let's hear about what you're doing there.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me. So maybe just to sort of transition from what Eric was saying, what you pointed out at the beginning, I think that the landscape is changing across the globe, but focus more on North America in terms of how we produce minerals, where the minerals are coming from, all of these things, how it was, and the pandemic is a good bullseye, like a pin to say that's where the pivot point happened. But as you pointed out, these things were happening before the pandemic. They all got highlighted. They came to the surface just because we had supply chain issues that were already a little bit tight, also exacerbated by lockdowns and people not working, and therefore nothing getting produced and so on. So this deglobalization and the shift is happening, and there's some really good positives that are going to come out of this. Those are that we're going to bring manufacturing, and the U.S. is leading the charge on this with the CHIP Act and the RA and the Defense Production Act, all of these things geared here in the United States, for the large part, to bring in supply, manufacturing locally to North America, but specifically in this case to the United States. There's going to be some short-term pain. I think inflation is going to be a short-term pain. If we want to manufacture it ourselves in North America, it's going to cost more. The benefit on the other end is we're all going to have jobs because we're producing all of these materials, all of these products locally. And so we're going to have a vibrant economy to go into the future with. And I think that's a very positive thing. And I think that we should look at it as a very positive thing, even though there might be some short-term inflationary losses there. And so when you look at from the Alberta lens, and the project is in Alberta, Canada. Alberta is known as a oil-producing province. It's the Texas of Canada, if I will. And we have huge oil reserves. A lot of them are mined with trucks and shovels. And that causes a lot of sort of social strife in terms of that, the efficacy and the environmental conscience of that production of that oil specifically. And it has limited its ability to be sold globally at times. And it's a frustration largely in the province. But we have the third largest oil reserves. So on the other side, when you look at it from an energy security perspective, which is a big topic right now, Canada has extreme energy security because of those oil reserves that we have in Alberta. And that enables us to, when you look at it from the perspective, I mean, the Russia-Ukraine conflict right now is highlighting how important energy security is. And so this theme is pushing us all to the same sort of inflection point, and that is that security is the problem. Security is what everyone's looking at, and security of everything now, energy, minerals, the whole thing, jobs, economy, everything is focused around that security, and everything that, not everything, but a lot of what we're talking about globally in the Western global side of things is about that security, and certainly a very hot topic here in the United States, and therefore also in Canada, because we are generally, as we were talking about this morning, in lockstep on a lot of these issues, Canada to the United States. So just a little bit about what we're doing in Alberta. We have a lithium asset. It was an oil aquifer, so it's conventional, it's not mining, and we actually joke, I'll give this to Lee, we say brines, not mines. We're producing a fluid from a well, just like you produce conventional oil. This aquifer was discovered by ExxonMobil Imperial Oil back in the 1940s, producing where we're producing since the 60s, but it's out of oil. It was only about a couple of percent oil at the beginning. Now it's mostly lithium-enriched brine. The company has been developing a technology to enable this, and we're not the only ones developing this type of technology called direct extraction that enables you to be able to take the lithium out of the brine. But the implications of this getting into commercial operations is that we talk about security of some of these critical minerals. North American production of lithium is limited to 4,000 tons a year. The world needs 3 million tons, and we only produce 4,000 in North America. So we have to go from pretty much 0 to 100% overnight. And that's what, when you talk about, like we're here on the industry panel, the government panel is going to be next. That's the challenge that industry faces. The government is asking us to do this. The partnerships that happen, and we'll talk about mineral tenure, but it does fall on industry shoulders to develop these assets. Governments in this world, in North America, don't generally go out and do the development themselves. They incentivize, they partner, but they don't do the work. Industry is left to do the work. So in Alberta, we have an opportunity to produce, and across Alberta, probably at least a quarter of North America's lithium demand by the time it ramps up to full production, which is not day one. It takes a long time, as you've stated. We'll have been doing this 10 years by the time we get our first production running. That's only going to be about 20,000 tons of the demand of about 1 million tons, maybe a bit less than 1 million tons in North America by the 2030 to 2035. So still only a small portion of it, but Alberta can produce probably 500,000 over time. But that has to keep lockstep as well with the way that the industry is growing. And, we talk about electrification. And electrification is the battery itself forms a pivotal sort of cornerstone. It's like it's a stepping stone, I think, more than anything in electrification, because you need to be able to transport those electrons efficiently and cheaply to make electrification happen. It's not the be all end all. The battery is not the solution. It's not an energy source. We will still use hydrocarbons as that energy source for a very long time. And that means that when you talk about the EV being green, it's not. It depends on the carbon footprint of the materials you produce, and it depends on the carbon footprint of the power going into it. So places in Canada like Quebec and BC have a near zero carbon grid, so the emissions to drive the vehicle are near zero. But the production emissions are still quite high. But the landscape in mining is also changing. As you electrify or hydrogenify, the heavy haul transport, you can therefore also bring electrification into hauling trucks and shovels and mining to bring the carbon footprint down. E3 and the lithium in Alberta, it's all electric. We use pumps to pump the water around. That's electric driven. We use we plan to use an electric process to make the hydroxide, which is the battery product. So, there's a two-step process. You make a precursor product. This is industry across the whole lithium industry. We're no different. We do it slightly differently, but the fundamentals are still the same. We produce a lithium sulfate, and that gets converted into lithium hydroxide. Generally in the world, that happens in two places. A lot of that hydroxide production actually is in China, which is going to cause a lot of problems in 2025 when the Inflation Reduction Act prohibits that from coming into these batteries. So we need to bring that North American supply on. The sources of the lithium molecules are coming from everywhere, Australia, South America, not from North America. But North America has the opportunity to bring conversion at the source. So that's what E3 plan is. So we're going to make the hydroxide locally in Alberta that we can sell directly to the battery manufacturers without having to go offshore to be secondary refined. And that's also an electric-based process. So 98% of our power, our energy consumption is electricity. If that has a low carbon to no carbon footprint, then the product that's going to come out of our process is going to have a low to no carbon footprint, which means when you look at it from the carbon footprint of the car, those sources of these products are decarbonizing. And it's going to take a long time to decarbonize them, but they are decarbonizing. We were talking to actually a counterpart at Euro company in Europe, and they're talking that on the North American average grid, if you account for the carbon footprint of the manufacturer of the EV, it takes 140,000 kilometers to get carbon neutral on that car. But that is drastically changing, because what's happening is that if you have an electric car, you can therefore enable low carbon sources of power, and you can bring that down. You can't do that with an internal combustion engine. So the path to net zero is an electric future, is an electric car, but it doesn't immediately enable it. It's on the path towards it. And so the path towards the goals to 2050, they only happen with electrified transport or hydrogen transport for the heavy hauling, which I believe is probably a good place for hydrogen is heavy transport. So I think bringing that all to head, what the world is seeing right now is a mini industrial revolution. I really think that's what we're seeing when it comes to electrification. And you're right, we're gonna have to make bigger power sources. We're gonna have to,
Nuclear.
we're gonna have to. I mean, we don't really have a choice. If we want to go carbon neutral, we're gonna have to look at these other sources. Europe is feeling this right now. We were in Germany last week, and it's a big topic about, should the government have shut down all those nuclear plants? And the general population, at least that we talked to, have said no. And so, transmission lines, all of these things, but this is why it's a bit of an industrial revolution, because we're going to have to grow all of this from, and not from zero. There's a lot of electricity out there in the world, but we're going to have more if we're going to power it. We're going to have to put charging stations. We're going to have to do all that stuff. So I didn't really answer your question about tenure in Alberta, and I can go into that if you want, but.
No, I think, Chris, what I'm interested in, if you could explain, because what I find fascinating is that the United States remains the world's biggest producer of oil. And Alberta alone is the fourth biggest producer of oil in the world.
Yeah.
and you have a reservoir with this added benefit, there must be these lithium reserves scattered throughout the sedimentary basin in the United States and the rest of Canada as well. This is like the new wonder thing. Are people exploring for that? I've got to believe the Exxons who discovered this one are looking at everything they have in inventory to see. Is that a potential savior here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's all sources of lithium that are being developed right now, whether it's a hard rock mine or a salar in the hotter climates or these direct extraction. I think we're going to need all of them, especially in the next 10 years. But I think it does bring on a supply that isn't there in the world today. It revolves around this direct extraction technology, which is just ion exchange. So it's water treatment. It's a giant water treatment facility. Ion exchange is used to take metals out of water. We use it in uranium treatment. We use it in water treatment for municipal water softener. Taking calcium out of water is the same technology. So we've developed, and our peers that are doing this as well have developed this to take lithium out of these brines very selectively. There are others doing it. There are resources in
But
Arkansas.
just qualify,
Yeah.
you're saying your project is capable of meeting 1/4 of the demand for lithium in the
Alberta's
whole
the
of North,
Yeah.
the whole of North America.
Yeah.
We just need 3 more of
Yeah.
these mines.
Well,
They've
and-
got to be in North America somewhere,
There
or
are
Brazil or wherever.
Yeah, I mean there are brines in Arkansas. There are brines in California.
Okay.
Those are the 2 big sources in the United States. They are both using these similar types of technology to get the lithium out of them. But like anything else, like it still needs to work. It still needs to be built. It costs money. All of that stuff still needs to happen, and that's where, the capital markets, the government funding, that's becomes the challenge at that point. Is they're out there, the sources are there, the technology is becoming more mature, so that risk is becoming much less, but capital needs to be deployed.
Great. Good stuff, eh? Time for you guys to ask questions. Lawrence?
Thank you, Diane. That was a very interesting discussion. I'm Larry Herman from Toronto. I'm a colleague on the executive with Diane. When we talk about critical minerals and electrification, it's all dependent upon microprocessing. Microprocessing technology is what we use to put into effect the lithium for purposes of electrification. And Chris, you mentioned something, and I wanted to have both of you address this. Last month, the United States, through executive action, put into effect a microprocessing rule. And that rule prevents, essentially, any development at the high end of microprocessing technology to be used in any transaction with China. And it has global implications because it covers not only microprocessing goods and technology in the United States, but anywhere in the world that has in any way involvement of U.S. microchips or technology. So when we talk about critical minerals, I think we can't forget the impact of this new microprocessing rule and its global effect. And it has an impact on Canada-U.S. relations in terms of critical mineral development. So I'd like to have some comments on what you two think this new rule will have in global terms.
I think, like, the day that happened, and I'm regurgitating this secondhand, you started to see people move out immediately, the intellectual property moving out. And I think it's a good case study. It's a good case study to see what's going to happen as we bring this manufacturing, because it's going to have to go somewhere. If it's not manufactured on Chinese soil, and it has to go to somewhere, is that back onto North American soil? Is that on another friendly nation where maybe manufacturing is still a bit cheaper? Those questions and how this sort of rejigs itself in terms of world politics is going to be a good case study. All of those chips are required for an electric future, just like the battery is. So they're as critical to the electric future as a battery. They're actually used in to make a lithium battery safe, you have a battery management system, which is a little computer that tells the battery how to charge and discharge, and those are critical to the safety aspect. So, yeah, I think that the impact's going to be felt for sure. But that is more immediate, and that's why I think it's a good case study, because we're trying to push the government actions. I shouldn't say we, but the government actions are trying to push critical minerals to that stage. But I think that this is instantaneous. Like it's going to happen very quickly, and so we can use it maybe as a guide to how markets and normalizing things will happen, and then we can sort of see how it naturalizes as it happens.
Eric, do you have a comment?
Yes, I guess I would maybe parse that observation / question a couple of ways. One is whenever you have rules and regulations that require something to be built or made somewhere, local contenting laws or that, it's a response, to the economic impact or security. The chip crisis, if you will, resulted in, tens of thousands of vehicles parked in fields and empty lots all over manufacturing facilities throughout the United States and in Europe and everywhere. And people realize, to your point, how fragile that was. I think critical materials, that's a value-added component of chip. They take silicon, they design it, to your point, ton of IP in it. When you look at resources like cobalt and platinum and copper and lithium, and you start creating a strategy where you have access to those, whether they're in your country or they're not. I think there are some lessons learned in that because we are going to be going toe-to-toe with some of our international acquaintances, China being one of them. In this very room yesterday, there was a map of South America. Karina was her name, I can't remember her last name, but she showed that when you source to China, they get the raw materials, a lot of them, from South America, okay? In 2000, most of that relationship was directly with North America. Now most of it's directly with China. Diane pointed out at the beginning that they've been creating those relationships for literally the last couple of decades. And to your point, Larry, I think if we're not late to the game, we're pretty close to it. I'm not sure what the answer is. What do I think about it? I think what we did before is we assumed it was going to work out. But I think what we see now that we know that low carbon, no carbon solutions are going to require electrification, they're going to require a fundamental shift in resources, we have to be a lot more strategic with these relationships and careful about how we pick fights. Because you can't, somebody once was, spouting off that it's easy to win a trade war. Well, if you have something to trade, maybe you can compete. But, according to what Steve pointed out at the beginning, there's 15 things on that list that we don't have a source for currently. Diane, I just want to loop back to a point you made. You said, based on Chris's description, is there more lithium sources that we haven't identified? I believe, as part of my original education, that we don't look for things till you need to look for them, right?
That's a geologist talking.
Well, it's
Right.
the truth, right? I mean, oil used to be, a nuisance or an exotic thing.
Right.
And we didn't know that it was under the ocean. We didn't know that it was in some place other than Pennsylvania. People forget that Pennsylvania was the oil capital of the United States, not Texas, But we started looking for it. And so, Larry, to your point there, I think it's just going to force us to put on the high beams and start looking at the future. Because I think a lot of us have a feeling in here that we've been trying to drive forward by looking through the rearview mirror. That only works when the road's straight, and it's anything but straight right now.
Hey, question.
So I'd just like Chris to sort of comment on the issue that the Canada Revenue Agency has ruled effectively that brine and anything that's an embedded resource does not qualify for Canadian exploration expense, which is a critical part of the financing of these mines, because if you can't get CEE, you can't go through shares, which means you can't finance
Oh, Lord.
exploration in Canada
Yep.
because you can't do it cheaply, okay? So I would just like to get a comment on, so that's an issue that brine does not qualify for CEE or CDE, which is Canadian Development Expense either, technically. About that technical impediment. So I'd like some comments on that, but also from you, from the panel here, about other areas where they see, like, we want to do this, this is great, we want to move forward, but there's a rule that says, no, we don't qualify. There's a rule that says, actually, we're going to benefit this other thing rather than what you're doing. Can you identify other sort of like key stumbling blocks that are government sort of generated that you can see in your path? Because it's not just about exploring, it's about turning it into, as you said, moving it from brine into hydroxide, and then that whole process. Like, are there other stops along the way that need to be?
One cheeky comment I'll make is, if you're not in Alberta, you've got a problem. Alberta is the best place to find anything.
Yeah,
But that
Yeah.
being said,
that being
Yeah.
said,
Yes.
But not only, like, I'm highlighting a very technical issue that I want everybody to know about, so I'll do something about it. But,
Yeah, you,
But I also, are there other technical issues that you see where it's like, this needs to be changed and needs to be changed now?
On the CE, the next panel, Jeff is going to be a good person to talk to about that. We identified this problem in 2018 and have been working closely to change the definition and the reliance on bedded and non-bedded in the CRA's reliance on Natural Resources Canada for that definition, which is where the heart of this is coming from. And I can't comment on how that progression is coming, but it certainly has been identified very clearly to the government that that is a problem, and that if the traditional way of viewing mines is that non-bedded is a mine and bedded is an oil and gas, so if it's bedded, it's obviously not a mineral. I think that's changing, but you can ask Jeff. They're on the forefront of that, and he's actually a good resource, so you have him here to talk to. On the other side of other government impediments, I think, Dan is right. Alberta is probably the best province in Canada to be developing. And, and you look at the North American landscape, because we're here to talk about Canada and U.S., Senator Manchin, who I got to meet this summer, got the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and then at the last minute, the permitting reform they had, and I can't remember the act that I got pulled out of, but in a second act got pulled out. And there's a lot of cry that says that without permanent reform, the Inflation Reduction Act is less meaningful, because you need to be, the not in my backyard is a huge problem. Alberta doesn't have that problem. And so from the perspective of where I sit in developing the project that I'm looking at, Alberta wants it in their backyard. And because this is an historic oil and gas aquifer that has had wells pumping fluids, and this lithium brine, like we're talking about these minerals, we didn't know about. I mean, we knew lithium is in this brine since the 60s, but nobody cared about it, and now we've developed a technology because people care and there's value, right? The value of lithium was so low you never would have approached this aquifer to produce from, and now the value is there enabling this, and the technology is required. So it's sort of a non-answer, unfortunately. The governments, they're there to, in Canada, I think the viewpoint is that they're there to support industry, but they're still a government, and they still have a government mindset to the way they operate. So, threading that needle is important for industry. But I would say that we've been, especially critical minerals, I've never seen it like this, that the government is so supportive of an industry. And I've been in mining for 20 years, and never has the availability of capital and support from the government been this strong for development of critical minerals in Canada. So I think that there's a lot of support.
one more question?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if this is off topic, so you could make someone else if it is. My name's Anita Barlow. I was founding team lead for the POLA program here that Mike has built wonderfully, and just finished, we're both co-edited on climate and security. So I've been looking at this issue from the offshore, and there seems to be a growing interest in looking offshore, both in domestic waters and international, for critical minerals. I wonder, one, if that falls into your purview as you're thinking about this, and second, in the context of shifting from a low carbon context, what are the environmental concerns, interests, regulation, self-regulation that occurs or is occurring or should be occurring in the context if it's on land and offshore? U.S. isn't even a member of UNCLOS, so in terms of international water. So what kind of standards are emerging, whether it's onshore or offshore?
That's a lot of questions. Let's just, thank you. No, you've made great points. If you would just quickly, each of you comment on offshore exploration and development around North America and anywhere else in the world, quickly, about critical minerals mining, offshore mining.
I don't have much of a comment. I'm not an expert in if you're talking offshore, like in ocean offshore, not, yeah.
I haven't heard of it.
I know a lot about the geological implications of it, but I'm not an expert in policy.
Shift back to land, if you will, in terms of, thank you, in terms of environment, regulatory, that process as it ongoes. Alberta certainly is aware of that.
Yeah, from the lens that I have, developing these projects, it's always consumer driven, right? When people like target oil and gas companies because they don't want people to burn hydrocarbons, that's not the source of the problem. The source is that we have to use them, and that's what we have at our disposal. And so the same is with the consumer. And what the consumer is saying, and this is your background, is that we want low carbon, tight ESG materials. The problem right now is that the supply is so short that they're probably going to just take whatever they can get. But as the market matures in the next 10 to 15 years and normalizes and supply demand starts to balance, or we're not, the prices come off a little bit and everything's a bit more in equilibrium, and you have choice, the choice is going to lead you to the low carbon sources. So for companies like us, day one, we might not have as low carbon of a product as we might in year 3. And that's just because strategically, capital it will add capital. And that's the other thing. You're going to have to pay more to get a low carbon for most things in this world. If you want it low carbon, you have to pay a bit more. And so at the very beginning, that means that we have to deploy more capital. That's why we have to charge more. We have higher operating costs. That's why we would charge more. At the very beginning, we will likely not worry about that and just produce it from grid power. Like I mentioned, most of our power is most of our energy is electricity. But we can bring in low carbon source power in Alberta. There's lots of technology out there that enable it to do this that are available on the market today, but that might add capital that we're not willing to do day one. But definitely we'll have to have it in place and have to design the facility to be able to add that, because it will become a very important metric in terms of our carbon footprint of our product in the future.
Okay, well, that wraps it up. Something for you to consider too in terms of your interest in environmental. There's some quite amazing engineering work being done in Alberta on putting carbon sequestration. But, filling these old, it's really quite interesting. It's not necessarily going to save the world overnight, but there's tons of money going into that. So we're done. It's a wrap. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.